Well, welcome to episode number 63 of 10 Minute Record Reviews. And this time I'm going to talk about Free's debut album from 1969 on A&M, Tons of Sobs. And I've got the original US release of this album. And as you can see, it has different cover art from the UK release. In terms of what to expect in this album, it's Free's debut. It's therefore blues rock. And if anything, it's blues rockier than the albums which were to come subsequently. There's a lot of remarkable things about Free as a band, and one of the things that probably stands out the most is that when they formed in 1968, all of them were teenagers. Paul Rodgers, the singer, was 18, Simon Kirke, the drummer, was 18, Paul Kossoff, the guitarist, was 17, and the bass player, Andy Fraser, was just 15 when they first got together in 68. They're a year older here, so if you can do the math along with me, nobody in this album is yet 20 years old. All these guys have been playing in the, what you might call loosely, the UK blues revival circuit in the later 60s. And the first two to get together were Kossoff and Kirke, who had been in a band together. Kossoff sees Rodgers playing on stage and hooks up with him. The three of them then are introduced to Andy Fraser by a guy called Alexis Korner. And Alexis Korner is an interesting character in the whole British blues scene. If you listen to Cream, the Yardbirds, Bluesbreakers, Zeppelin, you name it, you come across Alexis Korner's name. And he knew absolutely everybody. He was a matchmaker when it came to bringing people together in bands, but he was associated to all the great UK blues rock acts, but never made it big himself. So he played with Charlie Watts, he played with Ginger Baker, he played with Robert Plant. He actually introduced Robert Plant to Jimmy Page at the time that Alexis Korner, was recording an album with Plant, and then Plant was spirited away to Zeppelin, and that was that. And Korner was left holding the bag. And he's the guy that introduces Andy Fraser to Kirke, Kossoff, and Rodgers, and thus the full lineup of Free is formed. They were well connected, they were signed to a great label, so within a year they go from gigging in pubs to producing this. They didn't get a big budget for this. The whole album was recorded in a few days, cost them less than £1,000 to do, and that shows in the production. If you've heard other Free albums, you know that they have a very lean, a very spare, but a very professional, well-executed sound. It feels more rushed, it feels tinnier, it feels less, it's much less spacious than you expect from a Free record. These are early days, and you can tell this is not a band that has the freedom of the studio and the luxury of taking all the time they need to find the sound and the performances they want. And this album didn't shift many copies. As I mentioned, it didn't have a lead single, or any single actually. Just like their contemporary Zeppelin, who had released their first album just a month or two before, these guys are very much an album band. They didn't do a lot of singles, and their popularity largely rested on the strength of their albums, which are consistently good through most of their catalog until things begin to fall off the rails a little bit, sadly due to substance use issues once you get into the earlier 70s. But here, they're already reaching a consistent level of performance. Already at this point, what's striking, they'd only been together for a year or so, they had found a completely distinct sound, and they were courageous enough to stick to it. Another sign of the confidence of this group is that of the 9 songs in this album, 7 are originals, which is impressive for a group that hadn't been together that long. The songwriting is uneven, as you might expect, but nonetheless, that's another sign of the assuredness of the group. So side 1 starts with, in a somewhat peculiar fashion, Over the Green Hills, which is the only kind of gentle acoustic song on the whole album. And weirdly, it's split into 2, so you get about the first 40 or 50 seconds of the song to start side 1. It's Kossoff picking a gentle acoustic tune, Rodgers is lamenting over top of that, you then get a group vocal, and instantly you then fade into Worry, which is a straight-ahead blues rock number. The thing that I find most striking about this song is that Simon Kirke is trying to pull off what sounds like some kind of Ginger Baker impression, in that he's, just like Ginger Baker, in my view, doing so many fills and flourishes that he neglects to stay in the pocket at times when his band would probably appreciate that he did so. And so as a consequence, you're often distracted by what Kirk's doing. He's not holding the rhythm together, and as a consequence, the song sounds a little bit disjointed. Rodgers also sings a lot better in this album than he sings in this song. To the degree that anyone shines on this first full-length track on the album, it's Kossoff. But his good work on that song is really only a warm-up for the next tune, Walk in My Shadow. This is a 12-bar blues. It's really quite a good song. It's a highlight so far. Paul Rodgers, I think, shows here why it's a fine line for all these British guys singing blues, because there was a temptation, a kind of unfortunate temptation, which particularly Robert Plant fell victim to early on, to not so much just sing blues songs, but do vocal impressions of black musicians singing songs, which doesn't seem particularly tasteful, viewed in retrospect. Rodgers doesn't do that. He is one of these relatively rare British guys who can really nail a blues song without sounding like he's doing some kind of impression. He's very much just being himself. But back to Kossoff, he's remarkable in this song. In this song, and it's an interesting comparison because just like Clapton in this particular era, he's playing Gibson, and he's got a very similar tone, so the comparison's quite easy to make. He is every bit the equal of anything Eric Clapton was doing at this particular point in time in 68, 69. He's the absolute star of this song, and frankly, what he does here is thrilling to listen to. We're then into a song whose lyrical content, I think it's fair to say, has not aged well. The title of the song probably give you a clue, Wild Indian Woman. It just seems like the casual racism of the 1960s, and when it's not, dealing in those kinds of stereotypes, it's also just basically juvenile lyrically. The playing isn't that tight here, and it's basically a pretty forgettable track. But they redeem themselves with the last song on side one, which is one of the 2 covers in the album, and it's Going Down Slow, which I guess counts as a blues standard. And again, Paul Kossoff really, really shines here. I mean, I find myself listening to this and just being startled that this guy is 18. His tone, his inventiveness, his improvisation. It's like a guy who's been playing guitar for 40 years, not a handful of years. I haven't mentioned Andy Fraser yet, the bass player. Usually in this album he's buried in the mix, unfortunately. Here he's not. Steady but excellent playing all the way through. Interestingly, during one of their first tours of the States in the spring of '69, Zeppelin actually used to cover this song. I think it's safe to say that Free does a much better job of this cover than Zeppelin ever did. Partly, I think, because Zeppelin were, at that time, trying to do something elaborate which wasn't really coming off. Free are staying much closer to home, and they deliver really quite well. This is a real highlight, this track. But the best is yet to come. At the beginning of side 2, you have a track which is effectively the blueprint for the great music that was to come from this band, and that's the song I'm a Mover. It's full of incredible fills by Kossoff on his Les Paul, once again bringing Clapton to mind, once again easily clearing that particular bar of comparison. And I was critical of Simon Kirke on an earlier track, but here he and Andy Fraser absolutely are the backbone of this song, which is totally necessary because Kossoff has all kinds of places he wants to go, and they completely allow him to do it by staying right in that pocket. And Rodgers just crushes it in vocals. You listen to this and you think, these guys, as a bunch of teenagers, were playing this song in pubs just months before, and all you can feel is they must have blown people away at the time. Then we have The Hunter, which is another song with a slight Zeppelin linkage. It's a Booker T and the MG song when they were the Stax house band. It also appears on Zeppelin's debut album. It appears as part of the medley on How Many More Times, which is the last track. Of course, being Zeppelin, it wasn't credited. Here it is. And it's an okay performance. To me, frankly, it feels kind of slapped together like it's an encore or something at the end of a gig. They've also got a guy called Steve Miller, not the Steve Miller, a different Steve Miller, a well-known session player in the UK at the time, who's guesting on organ, which only adds the kind of jumbled together kind of jam session feel. The thing about Free, I always think, is their strength comes from the unity and the understanding between the 4 players. I don't think adding players really improves their sound, and that's certainly the case here. It's followed by Moonshine, which, although not as strong as I'm a Mover, is in the same vein, and it's kind of, the Free that is to come. Robert Christgau, the critic for the Village Voice, famously wrote about Free that they weren't stupid, just slow. And taking the tongue out of his cheek, basically saying, essentially what you get is unpretentious hard rock, and it's very much what this is. The writing, the arranging, and the composition, however, are just going to get better as time goes by. As we move to the end of side 2, we have Sweet Tooth. This song, to me, sounds eerily similar riff-wise to Spencer Davis Group's I'm a Man, in that you have the rhythm section pattern with an offsetting 7th chord, providing a little bit of relief back and forth. And it essentially sounds just like that riff. I don't know if there ever was any kind of lawsuit or lawyerly letters passed between the 2 groups, but there certainly would have been face value reason to do so. This album was basically their live set put on record, and what you can tell is, at this point, they just don't have that much material. They're kind of running out of gas a little bit. And then at the end, you've got the second part of Over the Green Hills, which is the song Bisected, which again is kind of a concept album move on an album that isn't really a concept album. It's a nice enough song, but it's kind of frustrating to have it split up, so you don't never really get to hear it properly. So the question really is this a great album by a bunch of teenagers, or is this an early effort by a band that would then scale greater heights? And the answer really is yes to both. Whatever the unevenness of the material they had, they've got two stellar talents in Rogers and in Kossoff, both of whom, to my ears, are more technically accomplished and talented than a lot of other UK musicians who were selling a lot more albums at exactly the same time. And every song in here is worth a listen, even if they don't all totally come off. So I give this album 4 stars out of 5, and there are great things to come from Free.